Hi, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, today we're starting the third session of the A topic of the semester titled World Wars and Decolonization. And here we're going to proceed looking at decolonization, something we started doing at the end of session 2 when we started looking at, in this case, India. So we're going to start with India in this session. We're going to continue covering that. And at the end of that, we're going to proceed to look at decolonization in Africa, and then towards the end, decolonization in the Middle East. So let us turn to our lecture outline. Now, as we're going to be moving into the 1930s, we're going to see that this party, the Indian National Congress, this colonial association led by colonial elites, allied with the middle class and also the peasantry, are already demanding total and complete independence from Great Britain. So again, this is now really moving the post goal, so to speak, to the next level. And here we see massive participation across India. There's already the formation of a collective identity based on Hinduism. And so once again, more and more people are joining forces. We talked about the working class workers, for example, their unions, etc. They're also joining forces with the independence movement as well. So remember, as we move into the 1930s, this is going to be a very, very difficult time for the world because of the global financial collapse that we looked at, in session 2. So it is in this time, in the 1930s, that colonial societies saw the opportunity to continue exerting pressure to the empires to be granted more and more autonomy and self-governance, and eventually independence. And so it is here that we see, for example, Mahatma Gandhi now becoming the leader of independence in 1930, leading a movement that was called the Salt March to the Sea, trying to break the British monopoly on salt in India. One of the resources that the British monopolized in India was salt. That was used as a preservative, for example, not only as a condiment or a spice, but also a preservative. And what Gandhi was trying to do is to break the monopoly by leading thousands of people to the sea in order for people to start mining their own salt. Again, this is a motion for self-sufficiency. So again, this is also part of this motion for demanding and achieving economic independence and self-sufficiency. Now, it is really in the 1930s that we're going to see massive uprisings and rebellions across the Indian countryside, precisely because the 1930s represented a Great Depression for many regions around the world, including India. This is a time of economic deprivation. The fact is that prior to the 1930s, Indian economy was very much active. It was producing exports for the British, particularly during World War I. But now that we entered the Great Depression, the economy in India comes to a halt. And again, this really created famine, particularly across India, particularly in the countryside. And so we see massive peasant uprisings against British rule. And here, Gandhi will be blamed by the British, and he will be arrested along with 60,000 people. So this is a massive, massive attempt to crush what could potentially lead to an independence movement that will be now very well organized and is taking quite another character. Although, of course, Gandhi prefers to have a non-violent and peaceful approach, but nonetheless, the British considered, this massive uprising as a sign that, again, the different factions and forces across India were now taking more decisive steps, again, to revolt. Eventually, in 1931, Gandhi was released, and he was released precisely because the British needed to negotiate with the leader certain concessions that will be acceptable for all parties in India. In other words, to appease, in other words, the most militant, the most radical elements of the independence movement. So they needed a spokesperson. So this is one of the reasons that why Gandhi got released. And one of the concessions that was granted to India was more self-rule for India. And this came in the form of something called the Government of India Act of 1935. So here, India was given now the right to govern their own affairs internally. They're still connected to the British Empire, however, but now they were allowed to form their own provincial assemblies. Again, so that every region, every town will have their own city councils, provincial assemblies that will be formed by members of the colonial elite. And so, again, pretty much granting a great degree of self-governance to India. So this was really a move by the British Empire to try to mediate, try to appease the most radical elements, once again, of the movement. Now, despite those efforts, we're going to see that after 1935, the independence movement in India is going to reach a boiling point. Okay, particularly when the Second World War broke out. Again, there will be new demands for independence, particularly during the Second World War. Again, this is, once again, an event in which, because India was tied to the British, India had to participate in the war, and they were forced to participate without consent. So once again, it appeared for the leaders of India's independence movement that India was simply being dragged into British conflicts on and on and on. And so this war, however, the difference between the Second World War and the First is that this time it was not just about supplying the British with manpower and resources. Now, this war had to be fought in India itself. You know, the Japanese are launching an invasion into the Indian subcontinent, and so the peoples of India will have to repel the Japanese forces and fight them in their own territory. So it's almost like the war is already coming home in India. In this case, here now India had to provide troops for the Allied forces. So unlike during the First World War, where India just simply supplied manpower that was used for labor, now here India has to supply manpower for actual fighting. Again, for actually fighting in the front lines. So again, this is really going to lead to more and more pressure, you know, to the British Empire, for the British Empire to embark upon a new treaty or negotiations to grant more and more freedom to the peoples of India. And it is here that the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, in 1942, feeling this pressure and trying to appease also India as well in this movement, offered autonomy. It's called the Autonomy Offer of 1942. In this case, they granted India total autonomy, in other words, internal governance at all levels, but still tied to the British system. In other words, the British will still be managing the Indian economy overall and foreign affairs, but internally, at every level, the peoples of India are going to be in charge of their own local and provincial governments and even the national government as well. The Indian National Congress, this party, rejected the offer, and instead they replied with something called, quote unquote, the Quit India Resolution. In other words, that they were not to compromise whatsoever with the British, and they wanted a total release from the British system, total independence and immediate independence. Again, this time it had the full backing of virtually every sector of Indian society. Again, it was nationwide popular support across the board. Now, the British tried to quell this motion by arresting pretty much the signatories of this resolution, and there were thousands of them arrested. They were sent to prison, and the rationale behind this is that this was wartime, and this was considered treasonous for the British. Not cooperating in this case with the mother country was to collaborate in this case, or aid in this case the enemy. Okay, so despite those efforts to quell this motion, this rebellion, still there were certain challenges that this movement had to achieve total and immediate independence. And one of those challenges was the Hindu and Muslim dynamic. Okay, within India, there is a Muslim minority, and they also want representation to govern their own affairs. I mean, they do have a separate religious and cultural background that is very distinct, different from the Hindu majority. And this is going to create, of course, certain tensions. The Muslim community are trying to embark upon also this path of independence. They're trying to join the movement, but at the same time, they're trying to represent their own interest as well. They understand that, well, if India achieves this independence, how is the Muslim community going to fit into a Hindu majority country, in other words? So the Muslim League, in this case, demand representation. One of the leaders of this league was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who in 1935 actually created this league and tried to form a political alliance with the Congress Party. Yeah, they're trying to join forces, in other words. Okay, pretty much the Hindu and the Muslim sectors or factions to come into an alliance and join forces in order to pressure the British for independence. But the Indian National Congress responded by saying that they were willing to accept the alliance, but not as two main factions or forces joining hands, but rather that they will accept Muslims into the movement, into the party, on an individual basis. In other words, not really as members of an alternative faction that represent a separate agenda or separate interest, in other words. So again, this was unacceptable for the Muslims, because if you're accepted on an individual basis, that will mean that your interest, your identity as a Muslim is going to be totally overwhelmed and overshadowed completely by this Hindu party, in other words. So they really wanted representation as a separate group, not to just be accepted as individuals, in other words. Again, so that was really one of the challenges that the movement was having up to this point. The other issue was the issue of caste. The fact is that still, India is still, up to this point, divided along caste lines, and each caste, of course, has also separate interests as well. And we got, for example, at the very bottom of society, the peasantry, and below even the peasantry, we have the outcasts or the untouchables, who are largely underrepresented. I mean, when we look at the leadership, for example, of this movement, they're made up of people of the upper castes. The elite, for example, the Brahmins, for example, or the administrators, the political administrators, the warriors, etc. Merchants, landowners, the people of means, people of power and knowledge, etc. They are the ones leading the way. And the vast majority of the Indian masses, composed of the peasantry, are still underrepresented. So we have this issue of inequality of resources, inequality of power as well. And that's another challenge. How do you bring all people together despite of their despite of caste, in this case, or wealth and power? How do you bring them together into a single movement? Again, that was really quite difficult. Now, the final motion for independence came really at the end of the Second World War. Remember that after the Second World War, Great Britain ended up quite shattered and weakened, to a very great degree. This event, the Second World War, internally provided also the opportunity for the formation of a colonial rebel force, so to speak, in India. In India, this was called the Indian National Army. And they were to fight the British for independence. So it's really a more militant, in other words, wing of the independence movement. It was, to a certain degree, sponsored by the Japanese. The Japanese understood, they were also imperialist. So as they were trying to move into India, they were also kind of fostering an anti-British force on their own to fight the British. So this is, again, something that the British are very much aware of. And because of that, at the end of the Second World War, the British tried a number of officers of the Indian National Army. Okay, they tried them. So this, again, led to massive popular uprisings and demonstrations. This event that, we got this kind of like a counterinsurgency kind of operation in which now the British are really going against the more militant, wing of the independence movement. And again, this really led to a massive popular uprisings and demonstrations across the Indian subcontinent. And just to remind you, this is a colony of more than 300 million people. And so with a weakened British army, this was really a lose-lose situation for the British. There would be no way for the British to send a force to quell this massive uprising across India. That was simply, again, not feasible. It was not feasible, not doable. The wherewithal, the resources, the manpower were not there. So the British had to concede. In this case, by 1947, they had to grant India its independence, just because, again, this was now a more unified movement towards independence in which all peoples, regardless of caste in this case, participated. So India receives its independence in 1947. The outcomes is that we have, at the very end of the day, despite India's independence, we see the failure of a Hindu-Muslim unification. So therefore, what occurred in 1947 is the partition of India into two countries. One will be India for the Hindus, and then for the Muslim minority, we're going to see the creation of another country, and that was Pakistan to the northwest, as you can see here in this map. Okay, so this is the unfortunate, again, situation for India, is that, again, we see the failure of unifying certain forces that were divided along religious lines. And another unfortunate situation is the assassination of Gandhi, precisely, again, in 1947 by a Hindu, actually a Hindu extremist and fanatic who believed that Gandhi was making way too many concessions to the Muslims, that he was just too soft, in other words, on the Muslims, and so he was assassinated by a Hindu fanatic. And that's another, again, unfortunate situation. The fact is that India really was the very first colony that achieves its independence through non-violent means. Again, this is really one of the greatest accomplishments of India. The second area that we're going to look at is Africa. Again, Africa, the continent of Africa, will constitute quite a separate case study here, very different from India, in that the independence movements of Africa will occur way after the Second World War, whereas in India, they all started back in the 19th century. here, the independence movement started out in the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War. Although in some regions of Africa, we see some early movements on the rise as early as the 1920s and 30s. But again, it's a really 20th century phenomenon. So between, let us just say, 1955 and 1963, we're going to see about 31 colonies in Africa gaining their independence and becoming new nations in the world. So again, this is a massive process of decolonization taking place. Remember that Africa was colonized by Europe in 1884, 1885 with the partition of Africa. The industrial empires of Europe entered Africa and pretty much divided into a series of colonial territories. And they remained pretty much colonized until the 1950s and 60s. And one of the characteristics of African decolonization is the fact that those colonies were more manageable than India. I mean, India is a gigantic territorial domain, with a also vast population. We mentioned about 300 million, for example. Whereas here in Africa, we don't see that kind of unification because the colonies that the Europeans crafted back in the 1880s were rather small. Again, so those were actually smaller political units. Again, so we see far more fragmentation within Africa and far more cultural diversity. This is not to deny that there was no cultural diversity in India, but Hinduism had really become a unifying force way before the 19th century, as a matter of fact. Again, we're talking about really the 3rd or 4th century AD. There was an empire called the Gupta Empire that kind of used Hinduism as a kind of like a national religion, so to speak. And ever since, Hinduism had become pretty much the basis of identity for all the peoples of India, regardless of caste and linguistic backgrounds and the like. A unified force. But here we don't see that. We have thousands of linguistic groups, different cultures and different traditions, all scattered across Africa. And the colonies were rather small because that's the way the Europeans craft them, back in the late 19th century. By the time of independence, those colonies had anywhere between 10 to 15 million people each. So those were far more manageable than the revolution in India, in which you have 300 million people to actually control. Here, again, the Europeans will have a different experience managing those insurgencies, in this case, because those were actually smaller units, smaller political units. Another issue that is very characteristic of African decolonization or independence movements is the factor of tribal differences. There are significant differences when you look at Africa. There are hundreds of tribal groups living within Africa, but even within the colonies themselves, we see multiple and even conflicting groups living within those colonial territories. Again, this really had to do with the irrationality of European colonialism, meaning that when the Europeans came in to divide the continent of Africa amongst themselves, they did not really take into account tribal conflicts, for example, that had remained in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in many cases, when they created a colony, they incorporated those tribal groups within the same colony. And so that kind of ensured, to a certain degree, instability within the colony itself. The colony was not really manageable just because there was a lot of inter-tribal warfare. But at the same time, consider this, that when those colonies are going to gain their independence, when they move into nationhood, those tribal groups are going to also compete with one another over over the leadership of the country. Which tribal group is going to be represented in the state, and which tribal group is going to dictate policy. Because ultimately, again, this is consistent with this idea of ethnicity and self-determination, the self-determination of certain groups to have their own country. And so there's going to be a lot of tribal conflict and tribal warfare once those groups are going to start moving towards independence. Okay. And even after independence, again, those tribal conflicts will continue even into the national period in the form of civil wars, for example. So this is a very unfortunate situation. Now here, for example, just to kind of explain or present a series of case studies, let's look, for example, at Congo. We talked about Congo very early on in the course. This is a region that was originally colonized by the Portuguese. Later on, this was a territory that was taken by Belgium. Okay, if you recall, when in the 19th century the King of Belgium acquired this colony for himself, he granted a series of companies, trading companies or corporations, certain rights to exploit resources, again, in order to benefit, of course, industrialization back in Belgium. So this is a colony that was governed by a series of companies, not by a colonial government. This is very important, okay? Not a colonial government. It's company rule. So there was massive exploitation. It's very well documented. There were excesses committed here in terms of those companies pretty much, extracting not only resources from the land, but pretty much exploiting labor to the maximum. Okay, and they exerted also severe punishments to people that were fleeing, for example, plantations or mines, etc. as well. This is also a colony in which we don't see, for example, an educated colonial elite, the way we saw that, for example, back in India. Here, only 16 Congolese were considered to be educated. Only 16, again, out of millions of people that inhabited the colony. This colony of Congo was divided into 6 economic regions. Those were agricultural, others were mining for minerals, for example. We also have, for example, lumber industries and the like, all scattered across this region. Okay, and we also see dozens of tribal groups, also each with their own traditions and linguistic background, etc. Okay, very, very different from one another. So again, this idea that, the people of Congo are just all the same. They're just one single people. They're all Congolese or they're all African. Again, this is not a very accurate way of understanding ethnic and linguistic diversity within Africa. Now, in 1961, after a series of attempts by the peoples of Congo to organize a movement towards independence, it was finally achieved in 1961. But due to the fact that we see a great diversity of tribal differences and ethnic, linguistic, cultural backgrounds, immediately after independence, those tribal groups are going to embark upon a civil war, trying to determine which of those tribal groups are going to seize the state and determine policy. Because their idea of nationality was very much based on tribal identification. Okay, they were not really at that moment incorporating all tribal groups of the region, but rather which tribal group is going to actually control the state, control the resources, control policy, etc. That will benefit only that tribal group. Again, this is the unfortunate situation. Angola is another region just south of Congo. This is another region that was also colonized by the Portuguese. It remained in the hands of the Portuguese, with the exception of Congo. Congo, again, was transferred to Belgium in the 19th century, but Angola continued being a colony of Portugal. And likewise, it is really in the 1950s that we're going to see also insurgent organizations. And here we see far more organization. For example, and you can see tribal differences as well, even within those organizations. The FNLA, for example, this was an organization that was claiming also independence of Angola, and it was headquartered in the northern region of Angola. And there were really peoples that had deep connections with the peoples of the Congo to the north. So they were often referred as the organization that represents the Congo in this case. All right, they were the Northern Alliance. Now, in the Western Coast, we have another organization, the MPLA. They were also, again, known as a tribal group known as the Mundo, who also represented quite a very different, distinct tribal association and alliance, in the Western Coast. They were separate from the Congo's association of the north of Angola. And to the south, we're going to see yet another organization, the UNITA, and they represented yet another tribal group, the Ovinmundo, again, who were considered indigenous, of course, groups within Angola. They called themselves the true Angolans in this case. They were far more militant, more rebellious, and what we see is a motion for independence in Angola made up of different organizations that represent different tribal groupings that initially joined forces to achieve independence. But once independence was achieved in 1971, this came, as a result of Portugal going through a military coup, and there was a change of government back in Portugal, and the new government that seized power in Portugal extended independence to Angola. So once Angola achieved its independence in 1971, this new country, Angola, plunged also into a very bloody and violent civil war as well. Okay? And that had to do, once again, with which tribe is going to seize control of the state. Because from their perspective, this struggle for independence was not a national struggle. It was a tribal struggle, a tribal independence. Okay? So they get very, very important to note. All right, so another critical element is the size of European settler population. This is another very critical element for understanding decolonization in Africa because, in some situations, those colonies had small European populations, and in other cases, a very large European population. And this is going to determine what kind of struggle, are we going to have in that particular colony. When you have a small European population, you're going to have a smooth transition towards independence. But when the population was larger, that larger population is going to oppose independence, and they are going to take up arms against the insurgents, and this is going to create violent struggles, in other words, and that will be much prolonged and more violent. Okay, so let me give you just a couple of examples here. For example, when we look at small European population, let's look at the Gold Coast. Again, this is a British colony that was used by the British to extract certain cash crops, in this case, coffee. Again, the growth of coffee, one cash crop for exports for the British. Now, this is a region that has a very tropical climate that was not very attractive to British people, just because it was way too hot and too humid. So this had a very small European population or British settlers living in the colony itself of the Gold Coast. Again, so it has a small British population, and instead, African farmers were the ones growing the coffee for the British merchants. Now, the African farmers feel very much exploited because they were selling their coffee to the British merchants at very, very low prices. And they couldn't trade with anybody else. Again, they only had to trade with the mother country. And also, all their fertilizers and equipment and machinery had to be purchased by the British at very high prices as well. So again, this is really going to create the struggle for independence. The African farmers themselves, in charge of those coffee plantations, are going to start, for example, embarking upon certain actions like boycotts, trying to boycott British merchants and British goods, trying to trade outside of the British system, and so on. Again, and they're also trying to form their own internal political party to represent their interest. This was known as the Convention People's Party of 1949. Again, so they were, just like in India, made up of colonial educated elites. They're appropriating British ideas, and initially they don't demand full independence, but as time progressed, they're going to demand more and more to the British full independence. And the British, in this case, instead of quelling the rebellion, what they do is that they start preparing this colony, the Gold Coast, for independence. Slowly but surely, they understand that, well, they need to grant the people of the Gold Coast more and more self-rule, eventually total independence. But economic independence will not be granted, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to tie this region to the British Empire even after independence, so this region will continue to export this product to the British. Again, so they're kind of being practical here. They're learning, of course, their lessons from India. They understand that things can get out of hand. So what they're doing is that they're preparing slowly but surely people for independence, gradually, kind of allowing them to develop their own national anthem, their own flags eventually. And by 1957, they grant full independence and they create what is called the nation of Ghana, totally independent, but they're politically independent, that's for sure. But even the political leadership are very much tied to the British, because this is an educated elite that was educated back in Britain. So they're very much connected politically and diplomatically to the British Empire. And economically, this new nation remained tied to Britain as well. So again, the British are understanding that, from a practical point of view, what really matters is economics. That a nation can be fully independent politically, but as long as they continue to serve the interest of the British from an economic standpoint, that's what really matters for them. Okay. Now, when colonies had larger settler populations, however, things are not going to go that smooth. Conditions for independence will be far more violent, and this is going to be a more prolonged process. For example, Kenya. What we see here is that this climate that was not that tropical, and it still has kind of subtropical climate, of course, it was also suitable for agriculture, and this really attracted a great number of British settlers into the region to develop their own plantations. So we got a large planter class, so to speak, here in Kenya, British plantation owners. Now, they are the ones that are opposed to British policies because they understand that the British are trying to prepare the people of Kenya for independence, just the way they did that with the Gold Coast, with the nation of Ghana. They understand that there is also a motion within Kenya. There's an African insurgency trying to demand independence, and the British are paving the road for independence. So here, the ones that oppose British policies are the settlers themselves. And they're, again, led by, for example, the plantation owners, They are the ones, getting armed and opposing. In this case, the insurgents, Jomo Kenyatta, for example, who is one of the leaders of the insurgents, who is now facing the opposition by the British plantation owners. And there's, of course, violent uprisings. Okay. Initially, of course, the British intervene in this uprising, and they are moving forcefully in order to repress this massive rebellion. Okay, what we see here is that the British were not really doing this by themselves. This repression was aided and assisted by the British planters as well. So there was a combined force of British forces and also a colonial repression in order to quell the rebellion of this African insurgency, and this ended up in a very, very bloody massacre. About 7,000 people were dead at the end, and 80,000 of them imprisoned. Again, finally, Kenya got its independence in 1963, but this really was a very prolonged process that turned into violence just because, again, the population was still very much dominated by a very large group of settlers that opposed British policies. Okay, another example is Southern Rhodesia. Again, Southern Rhodesia is, another British colony that is also going to experience a similar process, just like Kenya. This has had a very large settler population, about 230,000 Europeans versus 4.5 million Africans. Again, this still, we have a vast majority of Africans. Now, the main issue here is the fact that this large settler population opposes British policies, whether we're talking about Kenya or Southern Rhodesia, for example, or in South Africa, as we'll see, because what they fear is that once this nation is granted independence, that they will become a minority. They will become a minority within a very large indigenous majority, African indigenous majority. And they feel that they will be repressed, that their land will be seized and confiscated, and that most of the policies of the state will affect them. It will not benefit them in any way. So this is one of the reasons why they oppose the policies of the British Empire to grant independence to those regions. And if there's going to be any independence granted to those countries, that they themselves need to be in control of the country. In other words, again, this is a kind of minority rule, in other words. So just like in Kenya, what we see is that the settlers, the white settlers here, are organized around a leader by the name of Ian Smith. He is the one leading the way for full independence. He, among his cohorts, understand what the British intend to do is prepare Southern Rhodesia for independence. So they're trying to oppose it. But instead of just opposing independence and crushing the insurgency like in Kenya, what they're doing is that they're declaring independence themselves from Great Britain in 1965. They declare full independence, the white settlers in this case, with Ian Smith, and they create in 1970 a new white government. So again, it's really a minority rule. 230,000 people, again, ruling over 4.5 million African, indigenous population. So obviously, this is going to turn into violence, because the insurgency itself is now trying to resist this minority rule government. And they're conducting a series of raids, a kind of warfare that is called guerrilla warfare, which is hit and run tactics. And this creates, again, a lot of instability within Southern Rhodesia. Again, this new white government, again, is not really containing such a massive opposition that ensued after independence. Another, again, example of larger populations of settlers trying to oppose British policies and intervene in the process of independence and creating their own country for themselves at the expense of a large African majority was South Africa. As you can see, South Africa had a population of 3.8 million people. So it's considerably large, compared to the other examples we just provided. And the African population consisted of 22.5 million. So again, the ratio is very uneven, of course. So there is already a motion now, ever since the 1930s, for the African societies, for the African colonial populations to move towards independence. Just like in India, we see the formation of a party, the African National Congress, as it was called, or the ANC in the 1930s. One of the leaders of this party was Nelson Mandela. Again, now, initially, it was just like the Indian National Congress. It was trying to just demand more and more participation, more self-governance. But eventually, by the 1940s and 50s, again, there's going to be increased militancy. In other words, more and more military campaigns to resist British rule. And again, this is turning into now a more armed uprising, slowly but surely. So obviously, the European population, most of which are composed of British settlers, but there's also Dutch, because South Africa was initially colonized by the Dutch. Then later on, the British took over that colony at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So there is a combined population of British and Dutch. They go ahead in 1961, just like in southern Rhodesia, and they declare independence. The white settlers declare independence in 1961. Okay, so in 1961, we see the formation of a new republic, the Independent Republic of South Africa. Okay, now this new republic, as it was born in a way that it segregated the indigenous African population. This condition of segregation in which, the state itself, the Republic of South Africa, is going to be led and governed and directed only by the white settlers at the expense and the exclusion of the African population. This is what is termed in technical terms an apartheid state, in other words, that this is just a state for a fraction of the total population of that region, and that is for the white settlers, that is to say. Okay, so that's apartheid. This is really segregation, the exclusion of minority groups or non-European groups from the state, from any participation, and the exclusion of those groups to live within the cities as well. Again, so they were segregated to live in separate communities outside of the mainstream. This was also conducted under a policy called the Homeland Policy. The Homeland Policy, again, is the creation of separate communities, ethnic communities, or polities, if you will, by the Africans that will be totally segregated and excluded from the mainstream white population. And this was known as the Homeland Policy. And the African population had no rights to come into the cities, again, of South Africa, the main cities. And if for any reason you had to go to a city, you had to ask permission. You have to get a pass, etc., stuff like that. Okay. Now, during this time, Nelson Mandela will be thrown in prison because he was still very much the leader of the insurgency, so to speak, of this political party that was representing the African population and trying to end apartheid in South Africa. So he was really considered a radical, an insurgent, and he was thrown in prison for that matter. So after he was thrown in prison, this party, the African National Congress, is going to turn to guerrilla warfare, something that we saw also in southern Rhodesia. We see, of course, an insurgency from below with hit and run tactics, and what we see is far more violence. So again, this process of independence is really prolonging and turning now to violence. Now, this idea of segregating, the African indigenous population through this so-called homeland policy is going to collapse. And it's going to collapse because the total economy of South Africa depended on African labor. Again, so eventually the African population will have to be integrated somehow into the cities, although they were forced to live in shanty towns in the outskirts of the industrial cities to provide the labor. But they're getting more and more organized, and there's, of course, a series of labor strikes across South Africa. So again, this is creating massive instability. Again, South Africa required the labor of the Africans. So this is one of the reasons why this policy is disintegrating. We have, of course, demonstrations within the shanty towns where the African population lived, and of course the boycott of white businesses as well. So that's another reason why this policy is, of course, collapsing. Now, this is going to lead to the end of apartheid, this idea of segregating the indigenous population, when there was massive civil unrest throughout the 1970s, 1980s. We see in 1990 the release of Nelson Mandela, and finally the end of apartheid. In other words, the African population is now granted full citizenship, full participation, the right to vote in Africa, and they're now integrated into the national life. In other words, the end of segregation. And we see the formation of a black majority government. So once again, this really showed that the size of the population is going to have, of course, a significant impact in the outcome. Of course, we also have Cold War interventions. This is another issue in Africa, is that this is the time of the Cold War, a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union to determine the fate of the new countries born around the world, whether they're going to be capitalist or communist, of course. And this is also going to increase violence and delayed independence. For example, in Zimbabwe, this is a country that was created from the civil war in Rhodesia that we just talked about. Okay, so what we see here in Zimbabwe is that there is indeed a civil war. There is, if you recall, a white settler government that moved towards independence. It declared independence from Great Britain in order to create this minority rule state. And that turned into a civil war because the vast majority of the population were, again, indigenous Africans. And what we see here is that the two forces, the United States and the Soviet Union, are going to intervene precisely when we see the formation of this new country, when we see the creation of a new country called Zimbabwe. Okay, so there's a civil war. Eventually, there will be intervention. There will be foreign intervention into the country to resolve the civil war. We see the dissolution of the Rhodesian government, the creation of a new nation, the nation of Zimbabwe. But the problem is that there are now two external forces involved in the making of this new nation. And those two forces are trying to shape the fate, the destiny of this new country. Is this new country called Zimbabwe going to be capitalist, democratic, or is it going to be communist? And what we see is that suddenly the two parties that were at war in the Civil War, during the Rhodesian Civil War, are adopting, if you will, certain labels, not because they were adopting the labels, but because the foreign powers are giving them those labels. For example, the white settler faction will be called the democratic capitalist faction, whereas the African insurgency will be labeled as the communist. But the fact is that those labels were given to them by the foreign powers that were at war here in Zimbabwe. Again, those were not really labels that those two factions are given to themselves. In other words, the African insurgency were not really communist in this case. They really did not really even understand that ideology. They were just fighting for self-determination, to represent their own interests as Africans, in this new nation of Zimbabwe. Okay. Another case study of Cold War interventions is Angola. And we talked about, for example, how in Angola we see different factions that at first came together to declare independence from Portugal, and once that independence was granted, they're going to start fighting amongst themselves. We talked about that again. So initially, the insurgent groups are fighting for Angola. They're kind of joining forces. One is stationed in the north, another in the western coast, another one in the south. We mentioned that there's going to be a military coup in Portugal in the early 1970s, and that led to the independence of Angola because the new government that took over Portugal granted independence to Angola. But then this conflict turned into a tribal civil war, and here, once again, the United States and the Soviet Union intervened in this new civil war, assisting one side or the other as trying to promote one ideology over the other. And what we see is a more prolonged and more violent struggle in which the process of independence is going to be delayed. Despite the fact that in the 1970s, the southern faction, the UNITA faction that represented, again, the southern Angolans, seized power, despite that fact that once they seized power, they had to launch a massive repression against the other forces. Against rebel forces, they used heavy violence in order to remain in power, and they remained in power all the way to 1998. So again, this created a very unstable country that really saw no peace across the years, just because, again, of the kind of tribal differences, but also the ideological battle of the Cold War as well. Now, the last region to look at is the Middle East. Again, the Middle East is totally quite different from, let's just say, India and Africa, in that, for example, this is a region that was, at the moment of decolonization, it was governed by a very large empire, the Ottoman Empire. Again, it was the Universal Empire. It was called the Universal Empire. It really was the force that controlled most of the Middle East. Most of it, not everything. But great portions of the Middle East was under the control of the Ottomans in what today is modern-day Turkey. And it had a universal faith, Islam in this case, and there were also kind of universal languages. Arabic was one, was the official language, but also Turkish, that was really the official language of the Ottomans as well, because those were Turks, and also Farsi, it was spoken by the Persian Empire. Again, so they had kind of like universal cultures, universal political systems, universal identities as well, based on faith, based on language as well. Now, we also looked at in previous topics at the European incursions, the French and the British, for example. The French seizing certain areas of the Ottoman Empire, creating what is called extraterritoriality, kind of self-governance within the Ottoman Empire, creating their own little colonies, for example, and the British occupying Egypt in 1882, again, pretty much seizing control not only of Egypt, but also the Suez Canal. What we're also going to see here in the Middle East is that at the end of the Second World War, when the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, the French and the British were given mandates by the League of Nations to seize control of regions that belonged to the Ottoman Empire in order to guide the populations of the region into nationhood. It was a mandate, in other words, that they were not really ready for nationhood, but they needed to be guided by a foreign power that had far more experience with democracy and nationhood. And so again, what we see is the French and the British pretty much seizing control of the former Ottoman Empire. Now, this created a set of situations within the Middle East, and that is poverty and economic inequality, something that already existed before the European incursions, but they exacerbated precisely because now we have a new form of European imperialism. There was an Ottoman imperialism on one hand, prior to the European incursions, but now that Ottoman imperialism is being supplanted, replaced by a European one. And that is really exacerbating, again, the conditions of the masses, particularly the peasants in this case, and also the working poor as well. Not only that, but there's also an added element, and that is cultural change. That the Europeans are bringing also Western cultural ideas and values as well. They're bringing European languages, they're bringing Christianity, for example, they're bringing ideas about, capitalism, profits, consumerism, materialism, etc., and secularism. So what we're going to see, there's several streams of anti-colonial ideologies now. We're going to see on the rise new ideological currents. For example, fundamentalism, again, is going to be on the rise in the Middle East, in areas particularly that were under the control, the domination of the Europeans. Fundamentalism really in the Middle East is not really the idea of just trying to follow certain dictates from the Quran, which is, of course, part of that. But fundamentalism, really, in the context of colonialism in the Middle East, is really a response or reaction against Western values, against these anti-Western values, is using Islam as a source of national identity, trying to create a national identity based on religion, on Islam, on the Quran, on the teachings, and so on, in order to repel and reject what they believe to be foreign values that are anathema to Muslim culture, like secularism, materialism, and what they believe to be also immorality. Certain behaviors by women, for example, and men, rules of conduct that are totally unacceptable to them, for example. This idea that we must separate church and state, and be totally concerned with the here and the now, and that spiritual matters are totally separate from everyday life. That they're trying to reject all of that, and instead what they're trying to do is create new communities, not necessarily based on nation, but rather based on the community of the faithful, religious communities, in other words. Okay, so this is a very different idea from nationalism. The idea of creating a nation state, for example, a national government that is going to represent the interest of the populations, for example, and legislate and so on. That, again, fundamentalism is trying to create quite an alternative vision for decolonization, that we can decolonize, they said, by removing foreign powers, but instead, again, creating a kind of religious community. Now, the other stream of anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism is nationalism itself. The idea of creating a modern nation state. So they do want to create a modern nation state, very similar to the ones in the West, with a modern economy, with modern science and technology, a modern bureaucracy, all of that, but within a very traditional cultural setting and society. Okay, so retain the internal culture, the customs, but modernize when it comes to managing the state and the economy. Again, so this is another stream of anti-colonialism. Something that we can see, for example, in Egypt, for example. Egypt is one of those provinces, we mentioned in the past that was actually, seized by the British. The British and the French occupied Egypt. They started building the Suez Canal, as a matter of fact, and they, at the same time, introduced Western cultural values and ideas very early on in the 19th century. So it is really in the 19th century that we see the French and the British occupying Egypt. Eventually, it was finally occupied by the British in 1882, as I just mentioned. But what we see is a kind of cultural transformation taking place within Egyptian society. And this led to a nationalist party funded by Mustafa Kemal in the 1880s. This nationalist party was also anti-colonial. It was based on the idea of Watan. This idea of Watan is the idea that, look, the basis of nationality, it is really the community, the village, in other words, the peasantry, the masses, in other words, that we have to form a peasant nation. In other words, that this is the ideal, community for the Egyptians. So again, this is a more nationalist trend, very different from the ones we saw, for example, in fundamentalism in just a moment ago, something we're going to get to in just a few moments. Suddenly, again, what we see also at the end of the 19th century is another alternative movement, Islamic nationalism. This is the alternative version of that, trying to create an Islamic community by Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, who is really trying to, instead of just creating a peasant nation based on village, creating an Islamic community. So we have two different currents moving in parallel, so to speak, trying to determine the future of Egypt beyond colonialism, from the Europeans. Suddenly we have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, and what we see is the Middle East bursting in nationalist movements. Again, there are nationalist movements, some of which are born within Egypt itself. What we see is two anti-British movements, precisely after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and when the British and the French pretty much are given the mandate to seize territories within the Middle East. So we have, for example, the Wafd Party and also the Muslim Brotherhood. No, they represent those two branches that I just told you. The nationalists and also the Islamic fundamentalists, on the other hand. And they're going to be pretty much, in opposition to each other as to how to create a new nation state out of Egypt. Now, Egypt becomes, so to speak, a sovereign state in 1922. It was given internal sovereignty in this case, but still it was largely dominated by the British, particularly when the British seized control of the canal zone, the Suez Canal. This was known as the 20-year allegiance. There's a British garrison, in this case, stationed in the canal zone in control of the Suez Canal. So they're really controlling the flow of goods that the British considered to be fundamental to the British economy. And it is really the presence of the British in the Suez Canal that is going to lead to a nationalist fervor within Egypt itself. So in 1953, we see the overthrow of the king. King Farouk is overthrown by a military officer, Nasser, in this case in 1953, who is really a staunch nationalist, who's trying to drive out the British altogether from the Suez Canal. So he is now in control of Egypt. He nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1954, and in response, the British and the French attack Egypt because this was considered a vital, region, the Suez Canal connecting Europe with the Far East. So again, it was considered to be of extreme vital importance, and what we see, of course, is the Europeans intervening in order to regain the Suez Canal, but it is precisely at the height of the Cold War that the United States and the Soviet Union intervene in this matter, and the British and the French are forced to withdraw their forces, and of course the Suez Canal is now integrated into Egypt itself. So we see the decolonization of Egypt. We have also new nation states being born in the Middle East from the mandates, in other words, from the British and French mandates like Iraq, Jordan, for example, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, for example. They are arising from the mandates given to the French and the British by the League of Nations after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now, it is at this point that it has to be understood that the British, when the war began, the First World War, remember that the Ottomans are in alliance with the Germans. The British came into the region and formed an alliance, with one of very powerful dynasties of the region, of the Arabian Peninsula, for example. From the Hashemite, for example, family dynasty, they build an alliance with Emir Hussein, in this case, in order to rally the Arab population against the Turks, against the Ottomans, against what the British are doing is that they're appealing to the Arabs, for help to oust the Ottomans in order to win the war. They send, a commander, in this case was called Lawrence of Arabia, to organize the Arab militias against the Turks to fight for independence. The promise was that, look, if you fight for the British, if you fight the Turks, the Ottomans, we're going to give you independence. The Arabs are going to have their own Arab state in this case. That was really, again, the promise, given to the Arabs. Okay. At the end, what we see is that the British and the French came in and took over portions of the Ottoman Empire, and they were given mandates, as you can see. Lebanon and Syria were given to France, and Palestine, Iraq, and Jordan were given to the British. Initially, they were there to kind of teach, guide the Arab population of this region into, issues such as nation building, nationalism, bureaucracy, administration, democracy, and all the like, to kind of teach them, in other words, to build their own nations. But again, by this time, there was now a new fervor, Arab nationalism in the region. The Arabs want to unify and create their own Arabian state. And there's armed rebellions, particularly in Iraq and Syria in the 1920s, against the French and the British, because again, they feel that the French and the British are just there to kind of control them, in other words. So again, the British approach was to install rulers in Iraq and Jordan. What they do is that they go to the very powerful dynasties, for example, like the sons of the Hussein, for example, dynasty that I just mentioned. One of his sons, Faisal, for example, was given the rulership of this region called Iraq. So they're going to create a separate country, the British, called Iraq, and they're going to install a ruler there. They're also going to create a separate country, the Kingdom of Jordan, and install the brother of Faisal, Abdullah, as king of Jordan. So they're kind of redrawing the map of the Middle East, and they're installing, of course, local dynasties that will appease the nationalists that are all up in arms trying to demand full sovereignty, full independence from the Europeans. So again, they're going to do that in order to not control the Arab population directly, but instead install pretty much local dynasties in place. The French approach was to crush the nationalist rebellions. They go into Syria and they shelled Damascus, in 1925, trying to quell the rebellion altogether. And this created a massive ongoing resistance that will continue all the way to 1945. Finally, the French were ousted, from Syria in 1945. What we see here is the rise of a new party. The Ba'athist Party, again, is a nationalist party that is trying to build a new nation that is Western. It is a national party that wants to create a modern nation state with a modern economy, with a modern bureaucracy, but still remaining highly traditional on a cultural level. Again, so what we see is a more convoluted, area in the Middle East in which still those regions are still very much, enmeshed, if you will, in nationalistic, outburst, in that the end result is that they are now remain pretty much divided between being ruled by princes or dictators. For example, Saudi Arabia and Jordan are ruled by princes of dynasties, while Iraq and Syria are ruled by, for example, dictators. Well, not necessarily today. But again, this is the situation, across the 20th century. The idea of fundamentalism versus nationalism, still very much a dividing issue within the Middle East. The Islamic communities battling, in this case, the nationalist forces that appear to be far more modernist. In other words, the fundamentalists appear to be more conservative and more religious, and the nationalists a little bit more modern. But still, despite the fact that still the Middle East is being governed by princes and dictators, the fact is that still the vast majority of the masses are still disfranchised. There's peasants and working poor that still remain underrepresented, if at all, in the state. and the problem of inequality hasn't yet been solved. And this, for the most part, has served as a critical element to recruit, for example, large numbers of people into the Islamic movements. Now, one of the greatest quote-unquote successes of the Islamic fundamentalist movements in the Middle East is, again, the disfranchised masses, that they're still very much left out from the national projects of the different princes and dictators and so on of the Middle East, and they become pretty much ripe for recruitment, within the Islamic movements. And of course, last but not least is the issue of tribalism. That, despite the fact that there are, of course, religious differences within the Islamic community, the Shiites and the Sunnis, for example, and there's also, of course, different anti-colonial streams, like the fundamentalist and also the nationalist, there's also significant tribal differences as well within the Middle East. That's another issue, that there's a multiplicity of different tribal groups, each fighting for their own tribal regions and interests, and this also creates, again, the conditions for conflict, within the region. So in summary, what we have covered so far is the 30-year crisis and also the process of decolonization. When it comes to the 30-year crisis, this is a crisis in which the European industrial empires were competing over resources and markets in different areas of the world. And because we are now looking at modern technologies and modern weaponry that was far more destructive than anything that had been available in the past, what we see is that those conflicts were far more shattering, more destructive. This idea of total war, the total destruction of their national armies and their national economies, compounded by the 1930s Great Depression, this global economic crisis, that actually created the perfect conditions for a weakened European system. The destabilization of the European empires. Okay, this is extremely important, how the 30-year crisis set the stage for decolonization. So decolonization, again, is the idea of, the colonies of Europe now moving towards nationhood, towards independence. Okay, so we see India, in this case, what we saw in summary, in a nutshell, is the leadership, the main participation of the Western educated colonial elites, in providing the foundation for resistance and organization, creating the first colonial independence movements and parties. And they're the ones actually organizing the resistant strategies, the revolts, the petitions for independence, and at the same time, using Hinduism as the basis of identity. Here we see religion in India becoming the national force, the unifying force that brought together great numbers of people, regardless of caste particularly, in order to unify and demand independence from Great Britain. And, in this case, it was the only movement, again, the only revolution, the only anti-colonial revolution that was non-violent. Again, that's the only revolution that used non-violent means. That's what Gandhi actually contributed here. Africa, what we see is tribalism as the basis of identity. We see great tribal differences and diversity within Africa itself. And this is going to also make very difficult the process of independence and nation building due to the fact that there's significant differences between them, and the nations in many cases excluded different tribal groups from the franchise, from citizenship, and that led, of course, to instability and civil war. And independence was also varied from region to region, from colony to colony, based on white population. Again, we already saw that, whether it was small or large, this is going to determine whether it was a smooth transition or a very violent one. Okay, in the Middle East, also we see religion as the basis of identity, in this case, Islam, again, and there's, of course, a clear rejection of Western values, secularism, individualism, competitiveness, for example, materialism, immorality, etc. This is, again, what fundamentalist Muslims actually, indicate that the West represented. Another issue that we see in the Middle East is the issue of nationalism. Again, that there are two streams, two currents, as you just mentioned. One was religious, as I just mentioned, fundamentalism or Islam, but also nationalism, the desire to imitate the West in terms of building a nation with a modern administration, a modern economy, and so on, but retaining a very highly traditional cultural setting as well. Now, the significance of all this, again, that we just covered, particularly in decolonization, particularly when we look at, for example, our current events, is the fact that when we look at India, Africa, and the Middle East, that the Europeans actually drew the map of those new nations, whether we're talking about India and Pakistan, or the new nations of Africa, or the new nations of the Middle East. They were all actually created by the Europeans. So again, this is another, element that we must take into account. Okay, considering, of course, current events today. All right, so this is all I have for you. When we come back, the last topic is going to deal with globalization. This is something that I will announce when we come back. This is all I have for you as for now. Thank you.